She said it the way people say things they have said so many times inside their own head that the words have lost their edges. Not with tears, not with bitterness, just with the flat, careful steadiness of a woman who has made peace with something she never should have had to make peace with. My son hasn't called in 10 years. She was sitting at the counter of the Millhaven family diner in Pratt County, Wyoming, with a cup of coffee she had not touched going cold in front of her, and she was not talking to the man beside her, not yet. She was talking to herself, the way people do when the thought becomes too large to stay inside. Her hands were folded on the counter. Her coat was on. Her purse was on her lap the way older women hold purses when they are in a public place alone and are trying not to look like it. Outside the diner window, the December sky had gone the color of iron. She had no idea who was sitting 2 stools down. She had no idea what was about to change. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe and follow it all the way to the end, because what that Marine discovered about why her son stopped calling will restore your faith in the possibility of second chances. We read every single one of your comments. Staff Sergeant Ethan Rourke, United States Marine Corps, retired, had been in Pratt County for 3 weeks when the woman 2 stools down said those words and his coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He was not eavesdropping. He was the kind of man who processed everything in a room as a matter of training that had become a matter of habit. The exit behind the counter, the age of the man at the far booth, the fact that the woman beside him had ordered nothing and been sitting for 22 minutes without removing her coat. He noticed things. He had been noticing things since Helmand. He could not stop. Ethan was 40 years old, built lean and deliberate in the way of men who have maintained themselves not for vanity, but because the body is the primary instrument of the work, and the work had required it for 15 years. He was 6 feet, dark-haired, with a jaw that carried 2 days of growth and eyes that were a clear dark hazel. The kind of eyes that, in another face, might have read as warm, but in his read as something more precise than warmth. Attentiveness. The full, undivided attentiveness of a man who was genuinely present in whatever room he occupied, who did not look at his phone when someone was speaking, and did not move his eyes away from a face until he had understood what it was telling him. His nose had been broken once, in Fallujah, during a clearance that he described to no one and thought about periodically in a way he had learned to manage. His left hand carried a small raised scar across the knuckle of the index finger from a piece of wire in Kandahar that had not been wire. He was not a frightening man. He was a present one, which in some rooms amounted to the same thing. He had done 3 deployments over 15 years, 2 with the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, to Helmand Province and the Sangin Valley, and a 3rd to Kandahar with a combined operations unit that he described as a long, specific kind of difficult. He had come home from the last with a Bronze Star with combat fee, a medical retirement for the hearing loss in his left ear and the attendant tinnitus that arrived every morning like a second alarm, and a general understanding that the transition from doing things that mattered in places that were trying to kill you to doing things that mattered in places that were not was a distance that could not be measured in miles and had not yet been measured in months. He had moved to Pratt County because the land was cheap and open, and because the silence of eastern Wyoming in winter, even with the tinnitus running underneath it, was the closest he had found to the silence he needed to think. He had been thinking for 3 weeks. He had not yet finished. Max was a 6-year-old German Shepherd, 81 pounds, with a coat that ran deep black across his saddle and faded to rich brown gold along his chest and legs and face, with amber eyes that processed the world with a speed and thoroughness that still, after 4 years together, made Ethan feel occasionally outpaced by his own dog. Max's left rear leg bore a faint but permanent hitch from a fragment wound taken in Kandahar that had been treated in the field and never fully corrected, and the hitch was not a limp so much as a held memory, the body remembering what had happened in that place, even when the mind had moved on. His right ear had a small lateral split at its tip from a detonation clearance in 2020 that Ethan did not like to think about for reasons unrelated to the dog's ear. Max moved through civilian spaces with the particular quality of a trained animal who has decided that the world outside the wire is worth observing at the same level of attention as the world inside it, which meant he was always watching, always measuring, always tracking the things that didn't add up. He had been with Ethan through the adoption fight and through the drive from Camp Pendleton and through 22 days in Pratt County, and in all that time he had never once reacted to something that turned out to be nothing. He was not in the diner. He was in the truck in the parking lot, which had been running for warmth since Ethan went in, a fact that placed an upper limit on how long Ethan intended to be inside. The diner was the kind of place that exists in small Wyoming towns as a combination of function and community infrastructure. 10 tables, a counter with 8 stools, fluorescent lights that had been on since approximately 1987 and showed no sign of giving up, the smell of coffee and fried food, and the particular warmth of a building that is never fully empty and never fully warm. A chalkboard above the pass-through listed the day's specials in handwriting that had not changed in decades. 2 men in the far booth had the comfortable, specific silence of ranchers eating lunch, which is a silence that belongs only to men who have worked outside all morning and have earned the right to eat without conversation. A teenage girl behind the counter moved between the coffee machine and the pickup window with the efficiency of someone who has done this enough times that her body does it without asking her mind. The woman at the counter was 71 years old, and her name was Dorothy Crew, and she had the careful, upright posture of a woman who had been taught that you did not let the world see you wilt, not in public, not in front of strangers, not ever, and who had been observing this principle for so long it had become structural. She had lived in Pratt County for 44 years. She had raised her son, James, alone after her husband's death from a stroke in 1999, on a combination of the pension from his 22 years with the county road department and her own income from the alterations business she ran out of the second bedroom of her house on Whitaker Road. James had grown up in that house. James had been a quiet, serious boy who read everything he could find, and who had taken a full scholarship to the University of Wyoming at 18, and had called her every Sunday at 7 in the evening, without fail, from the time he left for Laramie until the call stopped. The last call had been 10 years and 2 months ago. She did not know why. She had never stopped, not knowing why. She had tried the number he'd had. She had written to an address in Denver that had come back undeliverable. She had written to the university, which could not share alumni information. She had asked James's only close friend from high school, a boy named Carter who now lived in Casper, and Carter had said only that James had gone through something difficult, and that he thought James was all right, and that he was sorry he couldn't say more. Dorothy had thanked Carter, and had not asked again, because she understood that not asking again was what Carter needed, and that what Carter needed in that moment was, for reasons she could not fully see, connected to James. She had been coming to the diner on the first Wednesday of every month for 11 years, and ordering coffee she did not drink, and sitting for 40 minutes, because the chair at home had become the kind of silence that presses on you from inside. Ethan put his coffee cup down and said, "I'm sorry to intrude. Did you say 10 years?" Dorothy looked at him. She looked at him with the careful measuring quality of a woman who has learned that the world contains people who deserve her honesty and people who do not, and who has become skilled at telling the difference. Something in his face, the attentiveness, the lack of performance, the way he was simply asking and not managing, told her something. She said yes. She told him the outline of it in 3 sentences, the way people do when they have been carrying something long enough that they have compressed it into the fewest possible words, because more words make it heavier. Ethan listened without interruption. He asked one question. "Do you know what happened 10 years ago?" She said she knew James had been in some kind of trouble. She knew there had been a woman. She knew there had been money involved somehow, not Dorothy's money, someone else's, and that James had been on the wrong side of something legal and had been too ashamed to call. She knew this the way mothers know things that no one has told them. She had known it for 10 years and had not been able to find the thread that would lead back to her son. Ethan paid for his coffee. He said, "Would you mind if I tried something?" He did not explain what. He asked for her phone number and gave her his. He told her his name, and that he had been a Marine, and that he was going to make some calls, and that if anything came of them, he would be in touch. He did not know yet what he would find. He was back in the truck with Max before the thought was fully formed, and Max turned from the passenger window and looked at him the way Max looked when the situation had changed and the handler needed to catch up to what the dog already understood. Ethan scratched the dog behind the split ear and said nothing. He had a methodology for finding people that had been developed across 15 years of precisely that problem in circumstances considerably more complex than Pratt County, Wyoming, and he put it to work from the front seat of a truck while Max watched the diner door and the December cold filmed the windshield from outside. He found James Crew in 4 hours. James was 43 years old and lived in Sheridan, Wyoming, 212 miles north. He had a listed number. He had a small tax preparation business that had been operating for 6 years under a straightforward name. He had, Ethan established through a contact at the Wyoming Department of Corrections, served 14 months at the Wyoming Medium Correctional Institution in Torrington between 2014 and 2015 on a conviction for theft by deception, a charge connected, the public record showed, to a fraudulent investment scheme that a man named Parker Dean had constructed and that James Crew had been one of. 7 people prosecuted for, despite the fact that a civil judgment 4 years later had established Dean as the primary architect and James as a secondary participant who had not understood the full scope of what he was involved in until it was too late to extract himself cleanly. Parker Dean had received a suspended sentence and had never served a day. James Crew had served 14 months and had carried the conviction on his record like a stone for 10 years and had not called his mother because the shame of what the record contained was a wall he had not been able to see over. Parker Dean was 39 years old and had returned to financial services after the civil judgment, with a fluency that suggested he had learned very little from the experience. He ran a wealth management operation in Cheyenne under a name that did not include his own, which was the kind of arrangement that people construct when they want the access of their profession without the liability of their history. He had 3 employees and 14 clients who did not know about the 2015 civil judgment. He had a website that described his philosophy of investment and a client satisfaction rating on a financial services review platform that he had flagged successfully to have 2 negative reviews removed for terms of service violations that the platform had not scrutinized closely. He had been conducting business without a registered investment advisor license for 22 months, which was a violation of Wyoming securities law that the state's Financial Crimes Unit would, Ethan noted, find interesting. Ethan made 2 calls the following morning. The first was to the Wyoming Division of Banking and the Securities Division of the Secretary of State's office, which shared a reporting portal for financial crimes complaints that he found, filed and documented with the supporting case numbers from the 2015 civil judgment and the current registration records, all of which were public. The second call was to James Crew in Sheridan, who picked up on the 4th ring with the practiced wariness of a man who has learned to screen calls and had not recognized the number. Ethan identified himself. He said he was not calling about anything legal. He said he was calling because he had met James's mother the day before at the Millhaven Diner in Pratt County, and that she had said 10 words that he had not been able to get out of his head. The line was quiet for a long time. "Is she all right?" James said. "She's all right," Ethan said. "She orders coffee she doesn't drink and sits for 40 minutes and then goes home." Another silence. "I don't know how to," James started. "I know," Ethan said. "But I found out about Parker Dean. And I found out about the civil judgment. And I think you've been carrying something that was never entirely yours to carry." He paused. "Your mother doesn't need an explanation. I asked her, indirectly. She needs her son." Max was watching him from the passenger seat. His amber eyes were steady and certain in the way they were when the situation was resolving correctly, not with urgency, not with alarm, with the particular quality of a dog who recognizes the moment when the thing that needed to happen is beginning to happen. That evening, at 6:47, Dorothy Crew's phone rang. She looked at the number for a long moment. She did not recognize it. She answered. Ethan did not speak to either of them again that night. He did not need to. He drove the 2 miles back to his rental house on the far edge of Whitaker Road, with Max at the passenger window in the cold December dark, and he put on coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table with the tinnitus running quietly under the silence, and he thought about 15 years of finding people in places that did not want to be found, and about the fact that the hardest distance to close was sometimes 212 miles between a son and a mother, and a shame that had gone unexamined for 10 years. Because no one had found the thread. He thought Parker Dean would find the next several months considerably less comfortable than the previous several years. He thought this without satisfaction. He thought it as a fact. 3 months later, the Wyoming Securities Division issued a cease and desist order against Parker Dean's Cheyenne operation and opened a formal enforcement investigation based in part on the complaint Ethan had filed and in part on 2 additional complaints from former clients that the investigation had surfaced. Dean's registration application, which had been pending, was denied. His firm closed. He retained an attorney in February. The 14 clients he had been advising without a license were notified by the state and referred to other advisors. His name appeared in the Cheyenne Tribune's business section in a context he had not anticipated and could not manage with a flagging request. 5 months after a December morning at the Millhaven Diner, Dorothy Crew sat in the kitchen of her house on Whitaker Road with James across from her and coffee between them that both of them were drinking. And the conversation had the texture of 2 people carefully relearning the particular language of each other. The rhythm of sentences, the weight of silences, the things that could now be said that had not been sayable for 10 years. James had driven down from Sheridan on the last Friday of the month and had stayed the weekend and was going to stay next month too. He had brought her a copy of the civil judgment. She had looked at it for a long moment and then folded it and put it in the drawer beside the photographs of James at 18, and that was the end of that. Ethan had been invited to dinner on the second visit and had come with Max, who had gone directly to Dorothy's chair and sat beside it with his chin on his paws and his amber eyes moving between her and James in the lamplight with the settled quiet of a dog who has measured a room, and found that nothing in it required vigilance, and that peace had arrived and was. Holding. The tinnitus was the same. The land outside was the same, open and cold and honest in the particular way of eastern Wyoming in winter. Ethan had signed a 6-month extension on the rental. He had found a property on the county edge that was worth looking at in the spring. He was not yet sure he was staying, which was the same thing he had said 3 weeks in and 5 months in, and which he was beginning to understand was not a question that required answering so much as a question that answered itself over time. through the accumulation of mornings where the place he woke up in felt less like a temporary arrangement and more like a location that had been selected by something more precise than chance, for reasons he was still learning. Sometimes miracles don't announce themselves with glory or ceremony. Sometimes they walk into a diner with a cup of coffee and sit 2 stools down from someone who has been talking to herself for 10 years, and they simply listen. God does not always close the distances we carry. Sometimes he places a man in the right chair at the right counter on the right Wednesday morning and gives him the capacity to hear what most people had been too busy to notice, that a woman's 10-word sentence was the longest cry for help she knew how to make. Loyalty does not require blood relation. It requires presence. It requires the willingness to follow a thread into another person's grief and pull it into the light, not because it benefits you, but because some things are simply wrong, and some people deserve better than the silence they have settled for. A mother waiting 10 years deserves better. A son carrying a shame that was not entirely his deserves better. Sometimes better arrives in a truck with Wyoming plates, with a German shepherd in the passenger seat, and the particular patience of a man who has learned to stay until the work is done. If Dorothy and James's story moved you, share it with someone who has been carrying a distance, a silence, an estrangement, a 10-year gap they don't know how to close. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever been on either side of a silence like this one. We'd like to hear from you. Your story may be the bridge someone else needs today. If you believe in stories of loyalty, second chances, and the quiet courage of people who simply refuse to walk past something broken, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. May God bless you, protect your family, and give you the courage to make the call you've been putting off, because the person on the other end of that line has been waiting longer than you know.